On June 19th, 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down affirmative action in the case Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus Fellows of Harvard College and the University of North Carolina. Wait a minute. This introduction is way too sudden. What is affirmative action? And how did we get here? By definition, affirmative action is a practice of policies that correct long-standing discrimination towards marginalized groups by granting them limited favorability in job hiring, higher education admissions, and other social benefits. To find out why these policies exist, we could go all the way back to the roots of American racism in slavery, but to understand where affirmative action specifically comes from, we start in the mid-1960s, during the period in which the heart of the civil rights movement was beating. After the movement secured concrete victories in 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education, in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, and finally in 1968 with the Voting Rights Act, the civil rights movement was shifting societal rules in historic ways. However, as the movement went on, active black civil rights leaders would be assassinated one by one. Malcolm X, MLK Jr., Medgar Evers, Fred Hampton, and more. These assassinations further infuriated an already rightly angry American population, and combined with the Vietnam invasion that was approaching the peak of its unpopularity, these sources of anger led to student unrest nationwide. This came in the form of protest, one of the most notable being the 1969 protests in the City College of New York. While national pressure was indirectly feeding into campuses across the country in general, CCNY was unique in its position as a university located in Harlem, a neighborhood 98% black and Puerto Rican. The problem is, black and Puerto Rican students made up only 9% of CCNY undergraduates. Now, this is a ridiculous figure in itself, before we take into account that 84% of that figure was forced to drop out as a result of racist teachers and the lasting socioeconomic injustices affecting black students. In almost every instance, black students were restricted from nearly all of the services and materials white students had access to. Some examples were the prevalence of underfunded primary and secondary schools, underfunded black and Puerto Rican communities, and of course, the overt racism prevalent in American society that went so far as to lead to the deaths of countless national activist figures. Now, CCNY itself tried to maintain a reputation as far away from this inequitable image as possible. It proudly flaunted titles with a strange obsession with Harvard, like the poor man's Harvard, or the Harvard of the proletariat, or the Harvard on the Hudson. You see, back in 1847, CCNY was called the Free Academy because it provided education to children in poverty and children of immigrants. Its first president, Dr. Horace Webster, had this to say about his university. The experiment is to be tried, whether the children of the people, the children of the whole people, can be educated, and whether an institution of the highest grade can be successfully controlled by the popular will, not by the privileged few. Dr. Horace Webster, 1847. Evidently, a ridiculous quote at the time when America was deep in the grasp of slavery. But the quote and CCNY's titles as the poor man's Harvard are equally meaningless claims when put into the context of the 60s, where, as we have seen, the lasting effects of the US culture in 1847 remain. As a result of the countless injustices in the face of minority students, the Harvard of the proletariat ended up with a furious black and Puerto Rican student body and surrounding community. This community was one that was systematically silenced, excluded, and angry. And what's more, this black and Puerto Rican community knew the potential for action, having witnessed the effectiveness of protesting over the last decade. So, all of this came to a tipping point in February of 1969. On February 6, black and Puerto Rican students occupy CCNY President Buell G. Gallagher's office to leave a paper that came to be known as the Five Demands. Here's what they entailed. 1. A separate school for black and Puerto Rican studies. 2. A separate orientation for black and Puerto Rican students. 3. That black and Puerto Rican students have a hand in the previously unaccountable SEEK program, which provided economic support to low-income students. 4. That the racial composition of CCNY actually reflected that of the black and Puerto Rican community. 5. That all education majors would be required to take black and Puerto Rican history and Spanish to remedy ignorance in dealing with minority communities. These are all simple demands. The most radical of them was to add a required class to the education major section. Yet, it took until May for CCNY to do anything about it. While they did agree to require a year of Spanish and Black and Puerto Rican studies for education majors, the rest of the demands were ignored until members of the Black and Puerto Rican student community took control of the South Campus. This scene played out for 2 weeks until May 5th. At the time, then candidate for mayor Mario Procaccino had obtained a court order to reopen the school, and classes resumed with the NYPD occupying the campus. On May 22nd, the negotiators ended up with a policy where half of each entering class would be admitted without regard to the grades that went effect into 1970. And so, the 5 demands were settled, creating one of the first instances of what we have come to know now as the policy of affirmative action. Affirmative action would be enshrined into Supreme Court law in the coming years. Brother v. Bollinger stated that race could be considered in admissions in the context of DEI. Unfortunately, since then, law supporting affirmative action has been chipped away at by the same people that resisted it at CCNY. And in 2023, the court struck the policy down, declaring admissions had to be race-blind. Make no mistake about it, this decision does nothing to create the equal protection the 14th Amendment discusses, and that Students for Fair Admissions bases its argument to remove affirmative action on. The argument is that we don't need it, since it gives an advantage to minority students in applications. This is not the case. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have any need for affirmative action, because marginalized communities wouldn't even be considered as marginalized. In an ideal world, everybody would be equal. But do we live in an ideal world? If you look at the news for about 3 seconds, read any story or op-ed or stat sheet about the rampant injustice we tolerate day by day, you'll get your answer. The advantage that they talk about is really just leveling the playing field. Getting rid of affirmative action only serves to further exacerbate the inequality we face today. Students belonging to a minority will be pushed under the bus to evoke the idea of an equal admissions process that has never once existed. All this while the facade of equality is flaunted in the same way that Dr. Webster flaunted it in 1847. Fortunately, the spirit of those occupying the South Campus has never really left us. The Supreme Court can declare what it wants, our lawmakers can proudly declare victory over affirmative action, but it is up to us to stick to the right side of history and prove them wrong. Protests have been a staple of student speech on campuses for decades, and they won't become a thing of the past anytime soon. As we protest, rally, and educate in support of affirmative action, it's important to remember what Harlem fought for in 1969, a people's CUNY. Their stories show us that our institutions will not move for us unless we move them ourselves. And to do so, we must remember the stories of those who petitioned for the 5 demands.